Okay. All right. I'm Steve Finicum, the Berkeley Historical Society. Welcome again to our 2017 annual meeting and our new exhibit opening. We're glad that you've joined us for this occasion, and it marks a special event in the history of our organization. This is the first time, I believe, that we've had an exhibit organized by a guest curator from outside Berkeley, who has come at his own expense from way across the country, and the result you'll see has been a great success. Our guest curator and speaker today, Dr. Willard Olliver, is a professor of criminal justice at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas, where he's taught since 2003. His areas of expertise including policing, crime policy, and the history of criminal justice. He currently serves as the editor for, this is long, the Southwestern Association of Criminal Justice's Journal of Qualitative Criminal Justice and Criminology. And he's the official historian at the Academy of Criminal Justice Science. He's both a former police officer, a retired military police officer, and a veteran of Desert Storm. For the past 3 days, he's been busy at one event after another in Berkeley and has given a number of talks, and yesterday a walking tour about Chief Vollmer, but he saved the best for last, today's talk, and the opening of the exhibit immediately following. After the program here, we'll take questions up till 3 p.m., and then everyone is invited to cross the street to the Veterans Memorial, where the exhibit will be on display for the first time. Copies of Professor Olliver's book will be on sale here, out in the hall, and also at the History Center, and he'll be happy to sign for you if you wish to purchase a copy. August Vollmer is a fascinating subject for a biography and an exhibit, as you'll learn today. Berkeley likes to think of itself as a notable city, famous around the world for all sorts of things, but much of our early fame came from Berkeley's role as a center of innovation and policing, and that's due to Vollmer. We are permanently indebted to Professor Olliver for researching this comprehensive biography, and I'd like to thank him on behalf of the Historical Society for this tremendous service to Berkeley history. I'd also like to thank his family, including his wife Judy, who is here, and she's making her first visit to Berkeley today. And thank the family for repeatedly lending him to this cause and to Berkeley over the past 10 years. So please join all of us in welcoming the Ollivers to Berkeley.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I've spent the past 10 years working on this biography of August Vollmer, so it's really exciting to finally kind of get out of my office, out from behind a computer, and actually present to Berkeley citizens everything that I learned. So it's a great pleasure to be here. One of the questions that I continue to get is, why did a guy from Texas end up writing a biography of a police chief from Berkeley? And the answer is, when I grew up in Virginia, when I went off to college, I had several professors that lectured on August Vollmer, and I was just in rapture over the stories that they told. And so it resonated with me. Then I became the professor eventually, and I told the stories to my students. And I could see the students just perk up and become very excited about Vollmer's story. And so I realized that, there was a lot to this. So along the way, I was writing a book called A History of Crime and Criminal Justice in America. And this was about 2005. I was about to send it off to the publishers. And I said, when I'm done, I want to read a really good biography of August Vollmer. I used everything that everybody else used, so it's the typical fare, they quoted the same things. And I said, I want to read a good biography. So I looked, and this is what I found. Crime Fighter, August Vollmer by Alfred E. Parker. It was a book that was published in 1960, and it was in the vein of the old G-Men books. So it was written to the 10 to 12-year-old crowd. Not exactly what I had in mind. But the book was good. It was good enough. Alfred Parker was a Berkeley resident. He knew Vollmer, and this was written 5 years after his death. So I decided, well, since a definitive biography doesn't exist, I'll write one. And that started me down the road 2006. I've made multiple trips out here to Berkeley. I've spent a lot of time with the police department. I've gone through archives, newspapers, Just to give you an example, I went into newspaperarchive.com, I typed in August Vollmer and ended up with 17,000 hits. I ended up with 12,000 newspaper articles that I printed out, well, my students printed out, and then they hole punched them, they highlighted them, and they put them in binders in chronological order. So I had a wonderful source for a lot of this information. So, August Vollmer, why August Vollmer? Because he's extremely important to policing. He is considered the father of American policing, and that's not just me naming him. That is so many other people in the past that have named him that. He's also called the father of forensic science as well. So to police, he's extremely important. To the criminal justice student, he's very important. He is legendary. But outside of that, he's not as important. But the key is for Vollmer and for Berkeley citizens, it's extremely important because Vollmer is your history. Berkeley allowed Vollmer to do all of the wonderful things that he did. Berkeley made Vollmer, but Vollmer in turn made history for Berkeley and did so many wonderful things for policing. So his story is extremely important, and that's why I want to share it. Just an overview, he was elected as the town marshal in 1905. He ran against the incumbent, won by a landslide. There was a lot of corruption, and that was why he was running. He ran unopposed in 1907, so again, he won by a landslide. And in 1909, when the town switched to a city charter, he went from an elected position to an appointed position, and he was appointed the police chief. Then he served from 1909 to 1932 as the police chief. And there was a one-year interruption, 1923 to 24. Berkeley allowed him to go on loan to Los Angeles. So Los Angeles got to borrow Berkeley's chief for a year. And he tried to clean up the corruption and all of the problems there, but he came back to Berkeley and settled back. Then in 1929, because you'll note the dates kind of overlap here, he went and became the first professor of policing in Chicago, University of Chicago. And then UC Berkeley wooed him back, and he became a professor here, double-dipped for a year, decided that was too much. So he retired and became a full professor at UC Berkeley. Then he retired in 1937 from that because of health reasons, and he taught occasionally along the way after that. One thing to keep in mind is Vollmer had a grade school education, and he taught at two major research institutions as a full professor with tenure. That would never happen today. The one sad thing, though, is if I were to mention these people today to you, most people would know who I'm talking about. Most Americans know who Wyatt Earp is. They know who Allan Pinkerton is. They know who J. Edgar Hoover is. Well, prior to 1960, if you said August Vollmer, American citizens knew, oh yeah, that's that chief in Berkeley. He's doing good policing. And yet somehow over time, through the 60s into the 70s, his name just kind of got lost and was no longer a household name. For the police and for the criminal justice student, his name continued to resonate. But for the rest of America, that didn't happen. So I'm embarking on a journey to try to make his name a household name again. We'll see how that works. Another secret about August Vollmer, and I always talk about August Vollmer, and the title is August Vollmer. Nobody called him August Vollmer. Everybody called him Gus. He was Gus to everybody, unless you were a child, in which case he was Uncle Gus. To the police officers, he was always the chief. There was no Gus, there was no August, there was no Mr. Vollmer, none of that. It was the chief. So nobody, other than probably his mother, in case he had done something wrong, called him August Vollmer. So who was he? August Vollmer was born March 7th in 1876 in New Orleans. So he was born to German immigrant parents, Johann and Philippine Vollmer. Johann changed his name to John. Philippine remained Philippine Vollmer. They grew up in New Orleans. Unfortunately, at age 8, his father died of a massive coronary heart attack. And so the family wasn't quite sure what to do. Philippine sold off the grocery store that he was Johann Vollmer was running, and they ended up moving back to Germany. That didn't work out too well because Philippine had gotten too used to American niceties. So, you know, going to the well to pump water and walking a mile back and that, no. So she decided to bring the family back to New Orleans. The problem was, as crime was rife in New Orleans, so she wanted to move to someplace nicer. She had some friends in San Francisco, and so they moved there. Cost of living in San Francisco was extremely high, so she decided to move across to Berkeley. In the meantime, August Vollmer got a job as a shipping clerk. And so he would go around doing deliveries is essentially what he would do. Eventually, he joined her in Berkeley, and this is where they lived, 1627 Louisa Street, which is now Bonita Avenue. The house has since been torn down, and there's a kind of a quad there that currently. It's like 4 apartments. The benefit to that is you only have to go about a block down and a block up, roughly. You have to excuse my Berkeley geography, I'm a little off. But he and a good friend, Ted Patterson, his best friend, they went in together to run Patterson and Vollmer fuel, hay, and feed store. And this was located on Shattuck Avenue at Vine in what today is the Cheese Board. That was their business. And on the corner there was a storage facility where they could store the fuel, hay, and feed and all of that. But they had ample room to be able to house equipment. And so August Vollmer organized the North Berkeley Fire Station, volunteer fire department, and they housed all of the equipment in the store, in the hay, fuel, and feed store. And so Vollmer ultimately was awarded the Berkeley Fireman's Medal for organizing this Berkeley station. Then this happened. All of a sudden, remember the Maine, and America goes to war with Spain. And so Vollmer sells out his interest to Ted Patterson, and the next day he goes to the Presidio and he enlists as a volunteer to fight the war against Spain. So very quickly he's trained, put into a uniform, and shipped off to Hawaii and then on to the Philippines. Now this picture here is of a time period. It's not of August Vollmer, but the gentleman right here is Edward Vollmer, his younger brother. So it gives you an idea of the time period. Vollmer ends up at the Taking of Manila, which really wasn't a major battle. It was really a handoff. The Spaniards wanted to get out of the deal, but they were afraid that if they handed it off to the Americans, the Philippines might attack them. So they wanted to play this little skirmish game, hand it off to the Americans, save face, and then that way they wouldn't be attacked by the Filipinos. What happened then is, of course, they now have Manila secured, but the Filipinos weren't given Manila back, nor were they given the Philippines back. So Vollmer ends up being a member of a particular group that would go around patrolling Manila. So this is really his first police experience, but it's only a quasi-police experience. Then the insurgency starts, and the Filipinos are now trying to take back their country, and so Vollmer is assigned to the Laguna de Bay. It was basically a river tour boat, and so they slapped sheets of metal on the side, put a gun on the front, a gun on the back, and August Vollmer was the forward gunner. So ostensibly, firing off of the front gun there would be August Vollmer. Okay, the picture's not detailed enough to know, but he was the forward gunner. He was involved in 25 engagements going up and down the Pasig River. But the key thing that was holding up, and they thought this was a solution to solve the problem of the insurgency, was the Macabebes, which was an indigenous group behind enemy lines, but they were sympathetic to the Americans. So the idea was if the Americans could link up with them, they could arm them and they could help end the insurgency. So Vollmer volunteered to go behind enemy lines. And the way they did it is they loaded up in a casco boat, which was kind of a flat-bottomed boat. They piled nipa grass on top, which was a common staple of moving up and down the river. And 2 Filipinos poled them, him, Vollmer, August, and a friend, a fellow soldier. while they were hiding in the Nippegrass, they pulled them upriver to make contact with the Macabebes. At one point, they were pulled over by a patrol, and the patrol started shoving their rifles into the Nippegrass. And fortunately, I guess they weren't too concerned or too careful, so they never poked either of the men, and they were able to continue on the way. And then they were able to match up with and get the Macabebes onto the American side. If you know anything about the Spanish-American War, at the very end, General Funston, with the Macabebes, is able to ultimately win and end the insurgency. So it was Vollmer's connection with the Macabebes that helped end the insurgency. But by that point, he was already on the way home. So he was coming back to Berkeley. He was hailed a hero for having been in the war. And in honor of that, what they gave him was a political patronage position as a letter carrier, a mail carrier, post office. In fact, at that point, every position in the federal government was a political patronage position. So when a new administration came in, everybody quit. And what they then did is they gave this position to August Vollmer. So from about 1899 up until 1905, he continued to deliver the mail to all of Berkeley. And by all accounts, he was a really friendly guy. Everybody loved him. Everybody loved Gus. The children would ride in the mail cart, and they would go around. He would give them apples and fruit, candy, and things like that. So he was well loved, which kind of positions himself for this run for town marshal. One of the problems of the time period were train wrecks. And so the problem was there wasn't a lot of safety considerations for trains at the time. As an example, the Berkeley station, there was no platform. So people didn't wait for the train on a platform. They just waited for it on the rails. And when the train came in, right before it hit them, they'd step aside. Pin and coupler system that linked the cars together, the pins were often really cheap and they would break. So you'd be going uphill and the cars would whoop, go on down. So not exactly the safest environment. Well, on January 16th, 1904, Vollmer was out delivering the mail. And he was up Center Street, up from Shattuck. And there was a flat car that had been left on a side rail, and it had construction equipment on it. And the construction workers had been offloading the equipment. That's when the commotion started. Vollmer looks over, and what he sees is the construction workers are trying to throw bricks on the back wheels because the flat car has gotten loose and it's starting to go downhill. Vollmer immediately drops his mail bag. He takes off running. He jumps onto the back of the flat car, works across the construction equipment on the flat car, gets to the other side. Now he gets to the brake wheel. But now he's got to figure out how to actually stop it. So he's testing the brake, and then he's got to get in a position to torque and apply the pressure. And the other problem is the brakes were made of leather. So there was no stopping on a dime in this case. So he's cranking it, trying to get it stopped, and just as he gets it to stop, it's right before he gets to Shattuck, as a commuter train is coming in from Oakland. So immediately everybody recognized he was a hero. He had saved the day, he had saved a lot of lives, and the next day in the paper, this comes out. Prevents runaway car from crashing into Berkeley train. So Gus saves the day, he's hailed a hero. That caught the attention of this guy, Friend Richardson, who was the editor of the Berkeley Gazette, who later one day would become the governor of California. Well, Friend Richardson called him into the office in January of 1905 and said, the problem that we have is we have corruption within policing. The town marshals were corrupt. And we want you to run for town marshal and clean it up. Now, at the time period, anybody going into policing was considered to be going into graft and corruption. So his family and his friends said, don't do it, you'll become corrupt. And he thought about it, and he decided he was going to do it, and he was going to be different. Now, a lot of people have thought that. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be different, and then they aren't. But he was. So they start campaigning. These little cards come out, August Vollmer for town marshal, and in April of 1905, he's elected by a landslide, and he is now appointed the police chief. So this is a Picture of the police chief, August Vollmer, with Fire Marshal Kenny, and Rickard is the the chair of the town council, I think is what it was called. So he becomes the town marshal. The first thing he does is he wants to adopt uniforms. The next thing he wants to do is he wants to fire off a lot of the corrupt cops. The next thing he wants to do is hire more marshals. Not just replacements, but he wants to expand it. So it goes from 4 marshals to 9 marshals, including August Vollmer. And so he's trying to professionalize the organization, and that becomes part of what August Vollmer ends up doing. Not just professionalizing Berkeley police, but all police. Now, at this time period, this is an example of one of the innovations that Vollmer had. Vollmer had many, many innovations. And usually what it was taking some other idea and expanding upon it and developing it. In the hopes that this works. So this was a silent film that was filmed in 1906 of the trolley streetcars coming up from Oakland. And, or actually I think from the ferry is what it was. It was coming up the street, what would be University Avenue. Well, Vollmer had read an article in the newspaper about a thing going on in Los Angeles. And it was a private security company. And what the guy had done is he had strung these red lights outside in the neighborhood. And people could call his wife, and then she would hit the button and the red light would flash. So then he knew that he needed to get to a phone to contact his wife to find out what the problem was. And then he would respond with his dog to the problem and take care of it. Sometimes it was a burglar, sometimes it was just maybe an animal or something like that. So Vollmer went down to LA and watched this. And he got the idea of bringing it back to Berkeley. And so he went in here before, I guess it wouldn't have been here at the time. He went before the town council, and he said he wanted money to string lines across the street with a flashing red light. Now you gotta remember this is before automobile traffic lights. And then what would happen is it would flash, and the police officers would then go to the call boxes, call back to the station, and get the call. And as a result, they were able to get to scenes a lot faster than criminals thought the police could ever know, and so they were able to catch them, many criminals, in the act. So the system ended up paying for itself, and again, it was an innovation that Vollmer brought to policing. Now there's a great scene right here, of course, where there's an individual who's on the tracks, and he doesn't want to get off, so the conductor gets off, and so do the other guys, and then they got to wrestle with them. And then the lady comes up and she starts whacking on everybody. And then watch this as he comes back, the conductor comes back and he kind of mugs for the camera. So even back in 1906, people were mugging for the camera, trying to become Hollywood stars. That's what it's believed, is that was a whole setup. They had to make it more entertaining. But that's just an example of many of the innovations that Vollmer would do. Then this happened. And this is about 1 year into his tenure as marshal, 1 year as town marshal. April 18th, 1906, the major San Francisco earthquake. Berkeley was hit to some degree. A lot of the chimneys were damaged and had collapsed. The high school had some damage as well. But that wasn't the main problem. The main problem was this. People were fleeing San Francisco, and they were coming across the ferries into Berkeley. In the end, it's estimated that about 40,000 refugees came into Berkeley. Now remember, Vollmer has 9 deputy marshals. So with 40,000 people coming in, living in tent cities, as well as the citizens of Berkeley that were already here, a little over 20,000, he had a crisis on his hands. So he could see them from the bay, coming across the bay, coming into Berkeley. So what he did is he went to his Spanish-American War veterans that were fellow friends, and he deputized them to become deputy marshals temporarily. Richard Schwartz, one of your own, wrote a great book called Earthquake Exodus 1906, and it's about how Berkeley handled those 40,000 refugees. And it tells the wonderful stories of how the university, the community all came together, and how Vollmer was able to create a safe environment for everybody in that case. But he utilized the Spanish-American War veterans to act as deputy marshals. And then the Civil War veterans came out and said, hey, what about us? So he deputized them too. In honor of that Christmas, because he had given them uniforms, he had made them a professional organization, he had expanded their numbers, in the Christmas of 1906, they ended up pitching in, all of the deputies, and they purchased him his revolver, a .38 revolver, Smith & Wesson, with his name engraved on the back strap. So right here it says August Vollmer. This weapon was just recently recovered by the BPD, and it's now in their possession. So they're going to start displaying it, and actually I believe Chief Greenwood is going to be bringing it over to the exhibit right after this. So Vollmer served as police chief from 1909 to 1932, after the town became a city, and he was appointed the police chief. He didn't have to run for election ever again. During that tenure, he did an incredible amount of things, and I could probably be here for the next couple days lecturing on this, but I was told to keep it under an hour. He also, again, like I said, went on loan to the LAPD, 1923 to 24. But what I want to talk about are four of the most significant contributions that Vollmer ultimately made. And I'll talk about a little bit about the different areas within policing and how he changed fundamentally American policing. The first one was training. He was adamant that his officers needed to be trained. But back then, it was typically, okay, you're going to be a marshal, here's a badge, here's a gun, go out and police. No training. He believed that officers needed training, so not only did he create the first police academy in the Bay Area, but he also started something every Friday where he would do in-service training. That's what it's called today. Back then it was called a crab session. So they'd all get together and the cops could, kind of moan and groan and complain about things, and then he would provide them some type of formal training. Sometimes he provided it, sometimes he brought in outside experts, like from the Red Cross here. And so it made a great contribution to American policing to provide that kind of training that they needed for the job. The other thing Vollmer loved to do is to look at technology and apply it to policing. So for instance, in this picture, he was not the first to adopt bicycles for policing. New York City Police Department had them as early as the late 1880s, back when the bicycle had the big front wheel and then the little back wheel. It wasn't very effective. In the 1890s, there was the bicycle craze, and a lot of departments adopted them. But Vollmer figured out that a police officer responding to a crime could get to a call faster on a bike than they could running. So he decided, well, why not every officer in his department have a bicycle? And so this is the picture of every officer in the department having a bicycle. Now, of course, the citizens of Berkeley absolutely thought that was hysterical to see cops riding around on bicycles. It might be the same way you might feel when you see cops riding around on Segways. It just looks kind of odd, okay? But other innovations, the same thing when the automobile became very useful, he decided to set up a system where every officer could have an automobile. And of course, again, the citizens of Berkeley started calling them the limousine police. So he faced a lot of ridicule for some of the ideas that he implemented, but ultimately they panned out to become just part of American policing. I mean, to see a cop in a car is ubiquitous today. In addition, he created the first crime lab. He worked with UC Berkeley to set up a crime lab, and this is why he's often called the father of forensic science. He was big into things like adapting fingerprinting to policing, the portrait parlé, identification mechanisms, record keeping, and he worked with one of his officers, John Larson, to create the first lie detector. And so the first lie detector ever was created by a Berkeley police officer who also earned his PhD at Cal which is probably the first PhD cop ever to exist as well. Along that way, Vollmer also saw the need and the necessity for police education, different from training. What he saw was the need for college education, higher education for his officers. So he started working with Cal to come up with a system by which his officers could get a college degree. So he convinced, somehow, the professors to teach for free during the summer to his officers, and eventually down the road, that would earn them a college degree, which ultimately became known as criminology. That program was started in 1916. It was a summer program that ran until 1932, at which point it became a full-time program because Vollmer was the professor. And that was the beginning of criminology and criminal justice programs today. So last year, criminal justice, of which I'm a professor, we celebrated our 100th anniversary. And again, it all goes back to Vollmer. The other thing, too, as I said, Vollmer became a professor at the University of Chicago and then came back to Berkeley and was a professor there until 1937, all with a grade school education. One of his greatest strengths was his investment in people, because he really loved people and he wanted to see them excel and expand their capabilities. And so he spent an enormous amount of time kind of shaping, molding, working with young police officers and others to get them to go on and do great things. So in this case, you have John Larson, who invented the polygraph, but at the time it was a huge monster machine. And a friend of Vollmer's and his son, Leonard Keeler, known as Nard to everybody, he got the idea to take this huge machine and shrink it down to a box. And if you look at a polygraph machine today, that's exactly what it looks like. So he invented the modern polygraph, which is called the Keeler-Larson polygraph. In addition, there are so many other people that he had an influence over them. One of them was Bill Dean, who was the head of the 24th Infantry Division, the first to go into Korea after the invasion. He was at the Battle of Daejeon and its fall. Unfortunately, he was captured. He was a brigadier general at the time, the highest ranking officer to be captured in the Korean War. He spent 4 years as a POW before finally being released. He also won the Medal of Honor. And even he, in his biography, traces his success back to August Vollmer. V.A. Leonard became a professor. He was a cop at Berkeley and helped invent the first one-way radio communication in police vehicles ever, and then went on to become a professor at Washington State University with Vollmer's help. And he carried forth criminal justice into the modern age and is extremely important for criminal justice education. The gentleman sitting next to Martin Luther King is O.W. Wilson, who again was another protege of August Vollmer's, who went more of a practitioner route. He was the police chief in Fullerton, the police chief in Wichita, Kansas, and eventually in 1960, he was appointed as the police commissioner in Chicago, which he held that position until 1967. So again, these people ended up making a profound impact, not just in policing, but in so many other fields. So those are the 4 contributions that Vollmer has made to American policing. But I also want to talk about 4 aspects of him as a man, because a lot of times when we hold these people up as having done great things, we lose sight that they're human too, and things happen to them, and they have their failings as well. One of them was he had a strong love for children. Part of it may have also been because of the fact that he could not have children of his own. This is a photograph that was taken by John Floria in the early 1950s. John Floria was a renowned photographer, went on to take photographs of Hollywood stars, Marilyn Monroe, a whole bunch of them. There's an exhibit, a museum down in Los Angeles that is a John Floria exhibit. And interestingly, we have 2 guests here, right? 2? 1. 1, okay. Okay, 4. We have all 4? We have 4? Okay, of the children in this picture. So, would all 4 of you please raise your hand? Yeah, come stand up. So that's, still look young. So let's see. That one is, you said that was you, right, Tom? Okay. And Gretchen. And then
I'm hiding.
you're hiding. Okay.
Oh, yeah, here,
All right, thank you very much. Wow. Thank you. And interestingly, this is the only picture I could find of Vollmer with the children, but it was, I mean, from his letter carrier days all the way up to the end. His wife would bake cookies for the children. Then after his wife died, he had a housekeeper, Lida Miller, and she would bake cookies for the children. Vollmer got one of the first televisions in North Berkeley, and all the kids would come over after school to watch TV. I mean, that was how much he loved children. In addition, he also brought in the first Boy Scouts of America into Berkeley. That was about 1916, 1917. And he also created, kind of modeled off of the Boy Scouts, the Junior Traffic Police. And the idea was a character formation to give the children things to do. Do we have any of the Junior Traffic Police in here? Wow. This is great. Wow. Again, August Vollmer. The ideas and the things that he did. One of the other things that often gets lost sight of is his respect for criminals, which sounds odd coming from a police chief, especially during the time period that he was the chief, 19-teens, 1920s. And I mean, even today, I mean, this is totally foreign. Back then it was totally foreign as well. But he used to encourage his criminals, the people that he would arrest, he would send to San Quentin. A lot of those criminals, when they got out of San Quentin, the first place they came was to Berkeley to visit with the police chief. He would pull out a bottle and have a drink with them. Just so many stories of these people, and he would encourage them. One of the things that he would do is if they were releasing somebody from the Berkeley jail, from the police department, downstairs here, he would make sure that they had a full meal because he figured it may be several days before they have another one. If it was winter and it was cold, he would provide them a blanket on the way out. He was he was very kind to his prisoners, and his prisoners loved him. He was also adamantly 100% against the third degree. He did not want any of his officers to abuse any of the suspects that they brought in. He used to tell his rookies, if you hit another person not in self-defense, you have just resigned your position. He was adamant about it. He also encouraged a number of his prisoners to write books, and many of them did. Jack Black is one, but probably the most famous is Chicago May. Notorious criminal, mafia, all kinds of great stories from Chicago and Chicago May. But she did. She wrote a book. She kind of went straight, and she made money off of the book. And then the other thing is, in the early 1930s, when California was thinking about going to the death penalty, Vollmer came out in opposition and said no. And he wrote this pamphlet in opposition to it. And he gave a lot of different reasons, but what it really boiled down to in the end was you were taking away somebody's dignity and somebody's humanity, even somebody that had committed a heinous crime such as murder. So again, he was very much a humanitarian. In terms of race and gender, he was very supportive of minorities and women coming into policing. Now, this was a time period where that wasn't necessarily accepted. There's a lot of different stories kind of that come out later, but probably the two of the best are Walt Gordon and Elizabeth Lawson. Walt Gordon was a football player for Cal, All-Star American, 1917, won all kinds of awards for boxing, and he was watching a boxing demonstration of Walter Gordon at the Elks Club. And he asked Walter Gordon what he was planning to do. And Walter Gordon, after he graduated, was going to go to law school. So Vollmer said, well, why don't you work for me at night and you can go to classes during the day? And Walt said, oh, that sounds like a good idea. So he became a police officer. And there's some great stories about, some of the tensions that came up. But at one point, 4 of the officers came into Vollmer's office. And they said, Chief, the bottom line is we can't work with Walter Gordon. And I'm sure they used some particular words of the time period. And said either he goes or we go. Now, Vollmer, it's from a number of sources and a number of stories. He had these steely gray eyes that could just stare right at you and unnerve a man. And he would hold a long pause to make sure that discomfort continued to build, that tension built. And then he said, gentlemen, I'm sorry to hear that, but you may leave your badges and your guns on the way out. Sheepishly, they left with their badges and guns and continued to pretend like nothing had ever happened. So again, Vollmer supported Walt Gordon in policing. He also hired Elizabeth Lossing as a full-fledged police officer. This was in 1925 because he had met her when she was working on her master's in social work back east. And he encouraged her to come to Berkeley and implement some of the programs that he had in mind that she liked. And this was a program to try to identify juvenile delinquents, not just from a police perspective, but from a hygiene perspective, a mental health perspective, an education perspective, etc., and try to intervene with those children before they went down the route of becoming, unrecoverable. Vollmer was also human. And again, sometimes we lose sight of the individuals. Interestingly, this is the earliest known photo of August Vollmer. He loved to swim, and so he's Remember I talked about the Patterson and Vollmer hay, fuel, and feed store? That's the best friends of Patterson. And of course they hung out with these regular beauties, all wearing the wonderful swimsuits of the day. But this is Pat Fell, and this is Lydia Sturtevant. This is Vollmer's first wife, and this is Vollmer's second wife. Kind of an interesting story. But how he came about for his first wife is they had grown up as childhood friends, everything. But Lydia had gone off to Europe to become an opera star. Well, she had come back because her dad had died and her mother was sick, and then he died. And in 1911, he got the group all back together to go to camp vacation up on the Russian River. And they used to play this game where they would shout, race. And they would swim across the river and swim back. And whoever got there first won. Well, Vollmer was such a good swimmer, he'd let them go race, run in, swim to the other side, and then he would jump in. And he'd still beat them. Okay? So Lydia came across at one point and went under. She got a cramp. Vollmer saw it, swam toward her. She came up, went back down. He swam down, grabbed her by her hair, yanked her back up, pulled her to the side, and started doing the raise the hands and lower the hands to pump the water out. It must have worked. 9 months later, they were married. And there's a picture of Lydia Sturtevant, one of her performances as an opera singer. They moved into the Sturtevant house, or I guess Vollmer moved in with Lydia, which was located at 2303, get the pronunciation right, Durant Avenue, correct? Durant. Got it wrong again. Okay. I was chided many times. Get straight with geography in Berkeley. Get your geography straight. So I still have times now with pronunciations. So they lived there. The problem was that Lydia wanted to settle down and have children, and Vollmer could not because he was sterile. Vollmer was very wrapped up in policing, so they just kind of drifted apart. So they didn't pay as much attention to each other as to their personal interest. Lydia spent a lot of time doing voice lessons for children in Berkeley, and Vollmer was concerned about American policing. So he left and moved into the Elks Club and was there just a couple blocks up from here. And he could walk to work, and this is a picture of him in front of this building on this side down here in the basement, which is where the police department was located. In 1921-22, he ended up meeting, he was working as the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and they were going to have their conference in San Francisco. And Pat Fell, the lady that was standing right next to Vollmer, they were boyfriend, girlfriend at the time, she had left him actually because he wasn't amounting to anything. He hadn't even opened up the fuel store yet, so she went away. But they met each other in San Francisco in the early 1920s, and after he came back from LA in 1924, they got married. So Pat was his second wife until 1947 when she died of a heart attack. And they lived at this address a year later after they were married. They had temporary housing, and in 1925 they moved into 923 Euclid Avenue. This address became the address known to all police officers, police chiefs, not only throughout the United States, but also around the world. He had police dignitaries from as far away as China, England, Italy, come to visit him at 923 Euclid Avenue. So again, a very important address in policing. He traveled a lot. He did an around-the-world trip in 1932 with his wife. They often went to Hawaii to teach. He would teach there to other police officers. He was very social. You know, the picture I use is a very stern picture on the front. You know, it's his professional look. Privately, though, he was apparently the life of the party. Everybody wanted to be around Gus. The other interesting thing is a lot of the parties where the children would be there, Vollmer would actually sit down in the middle of the floor at eye level with the children and play with them, much to the chagrin of the rest of the adults. Again, he loved children. I also found this picture. From the early days, he learned to play the guitar, and they would often have sing-alongs. And that was actually how they met Lydia Sturdivant. They met her on a playground, said, "Why don't you come join us? We have a little singing group that gets together." He plays the guitar, there was somebody that played the harmonica, and so they would play music. Well, when Lydia started singing, everybody else shut up. She was that good. But this was a picture from about 1950, and it was just a snapshot, but it was the only one I could find that shows him actually playing the guitar with neighbors playing music. He also loved to garden. At 923 Euclid, in his later years, 40s into the early 50s, he would often garden. And he wrote 4 books. And this is the last picture right here of August Vollmer. It's a color photo. It was taken by Sam Chapman, an officer and family friend of August Vollmer's. And it was actually taken by his son, which is kind of the direction kind of upward because he was about 5 years old at the time. Well, then November 4th, 1955 occurred. Vollmer had been facing a number of ailments since 1928. He had had a major coronary heart attack in 28. He had another one in 29. He had one in 31. He had another major one in 32, and I can go on. He also, in the last 5 years of his life, developed 7 different ailments that required surgeries. He had a stomach tumor that was non-cancerous. He had throat cancer, and he was a smoker. They weren't able to get all of the cancer out, so they had to go back in, and when they went back in, this time they nicked the spine. So he ended up with back problems for the next couple years before he ended his life. The worst, though, for him was the Parkinson's disease. It started to develop about 1941 because he was having problems with his eyesight. It wasn't diagnosed until 1950, and then it became obvious because he was having the shakes. It got worse and worse as he went on, and in 1955, he was starting to have bouts of dementia. And so during his lucid moments, he started preparing his papers for the future, calling things that somebody might kind of expose a friend for something that was a little personal. And so he would remove those and send them back to the friends. In the summer of that year, they had a new experimental drug to help with Parkinson's disease. It almost made him go totally blind. At this point, he had always said he never wanted to be a burden on his family, on his friends, or on society. and so he had decided to take his own life. So on November 4th, 1955, he waited until after 9 o'clock when all of the children would be in school. And then he told his housekeeper, Lita Miller, call the police, I'm going to kill myself. He then went out in the back where it's a solid stone patio, and so there's no, it would be basically easy cleanup, and he took the gun to his head and he shot himself. Lita Miller she went to pick up the phone to call the police. Sam Chapman was actually calling to pick up a paper because he needed to take to the university to hand it in to O.W. Wilson, his professor. And so Lita said, Sam, Gus is going to kill himself. Come over fast. Sam Chapman ran out of his house, didn't even tell his wife what was happening, ran over. He was only 2 blocks away, and he got to Vollmer as he was gasping for his last breaths. They loaded him up into a police ambulance, and then they took him away. Sam Chapman gave me the crime scene photo, and it's sad. And it created a lot of angst within the department and everybody that knew him. There were many Catholic police officers, and in the Catholic faith, you go to hell. But a man so good as August Vollmer, how could that happen? To others, they could understand the tragedy, and they understood the sickness and why he took his own life. So a lot of angst over that. It was compounded by the fact that August Vollmer had no funeral. There was no service. He did not want flowers to be sent. And so what happened to his body? He donated it to science. So there was no way for the people that were left behind to be able to grieve for the loss of August Vollmer. So he was taken away in the police ambulance, the ambulance that when he was the police chief had adopted. But he went on to do so many things, and he's left a legacy. In 923 Euclid, the American Society of Criminology was created in his living room. That organization still exists today, and I go to its conference in the fall. The Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, when criminology in higher education kind of went theoretical, the cops that were left behind were like, hey, this isn't what Vollmer envisioned, so we're going to break off and create the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. That organization exists today, and again, I'm the historian of that organization. So he left a legacy in terms of higher education. There are a number of awards named for him. ASC has won the August Vollmer Award, and recently the International Association of Chiefs of Police has created the Excellence in Forensic Science Award named for him. Again, his role in advancing policing through the crime labs and other technology led to this award. The whole reason that I have my job goes back to August Vollmer. And I tell that to my students every time I teach about August Vollmer. You're here because of August Vollmer. And so the reason that we're here today, the reason that, this is such a profound place to be able to present this speech, and again, having so many people from Berkeley, in the picture, and the junior traffic police, this is wonderful. So a great venue. I really appreciate this. And so ultimately, last month, the book was finally published after 10 years, and it has all of these stories and so many more, which is also why it's 800 pages long, so my apologies for that, but as my wife says, I can get long-winded. So, but that concludes my speech, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
This is not so much a question as a comment. I was a policeman in Berkeley in 1961, and the red light system in the call boxes were still in place.
I got to interview Sam Chapman, who became a police officer in 1950 and was the last person to see Vollmer alive. He just died a few years ago from Parkinson's disease, but he told me a lot about the red light recall, and he was the one that was always chiding me. You got to get straight with Berkeley geography, Will. You've got to get straight. So fortunately, still, if there's any mistakes in the book, it's my fault. I didn't listen to Sam is probably what it is.
I really want to thank you for rescuing from obscurity somebody who was so remarkable. My question is, why do you suppose that he has vanished? I mean, almost outside of Berkeley, almost nobody has ever heard of him. And like I said, I really want to thank you for the work you've done. But why on earth was he so overlooked? Do you have any ideas at all?
This was definitely a labor of love, so I guess I'll preface with that. But in answer to your question, my surmise is that if you think about 1950s, it was very much a religious revival time period, especially in the wake of World War II and the tragedy of that war. And so people wanted to get on with their lives. They embraced religion again. And if you think about most of the religions frowned upon suicide, you didn't talk about suicide or anybody that had committed suicide. And I think that's the reason that his name diminished with time, because of that issue.
Yeah, I also want to thank you for bringing August Vollmer back to public awareness, and your book is absolutely tremendous. I'm wondering what clues you found in his early life that led him to be as open-minded as he was. It's really remarkable that he, didn't believe in the death penalty, hired the first African-American cop, a woman. I mean, the views he held were so contrary to probably most of the views of the day.
He was just, you hear the statement, a man ahead of his times. Vollmer was definitely way ahead of his times. He just thought so differently from so many other people, and he really didn't care how they, what they thought of him or if they made fun of him. He was very much a progressive. He had a strong belief that government could solve a lot of the problems, that science and technology could address all of our ills, and that was a thing to embrace. But again, it was just, Vollmer was Vollmer. I mean, he had so many ideas and embraced so many things. I came across something from 1923 when he was the police chief in LA, where he was talking about we need to focus our resources to put police officers at certain places, at certain locations, at certain times, and maybe deal with certain people. Well, in the 1990s, they developed this thing called hotspots policing. And that's exactly what it is, putting cops on specific locations at specific times, addressing specific problems and people. And so, I mean, he was way ahead of his time in so many different things. So, I know that doesn't fully answer it, but again, it's just, he was Vollmer.
I recently had the occasion to be reading some newspapers from 1909, 1910, and in neighboring Oakland, beating up suspects was absolutely standard police procedure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just very striking, and I'm glad you mentioned that part, but I'd sort of reiterate the previous question. Do you have any clues on what brought him to this much more humane and sensible approach?
Yeah, it was definitely a time period of beat first and ask questions later, that's for sure. Again, what I'd like to point to is religion, teaching him the fundamentals, but by all accounts, he wasn't a very religious man. There was an account where a friend of his, when they went to the Philippines, his mother had given him a Bible and told him to read this. So he and his friend said, okay, my mom said, Vollmer said, my mom said I got to read this, so let's start reading this. So he would read until he, couldn't read anymore, and then he would pass it off, and then his friend would read it, and they just kept doing that until they finished the Bible. Maybe that had an influence, but I don't know. He was very much, though, humanitarian, and for whatever reason, but again, there's no strong link to religion. Not really. It was just simply, from what I could gather, is that the incumbent marshal, which was corrupt, was a Democrat. So in order to run against him, well, you probably should be the Republican. So that was largely why he ran it. He ended up even actually serving with the communist, I believe it was the Socialist Party mayor. Yes, thank you. And they got along fine. So by all accounts, I mean, politics didn't seem to play. There was a lot of people that wanted him to run for the mayor of Berkeley, the governor of California, all kinds of different offices. And I really think that he probably could easily have won those offices and done very well. He probably would have done well at anything he tried. But his interest, his strong pursuit, was police education, policing, police training, police reform, police professionalization, police.
Okay, so we've reached 3 o'clock, the end of our broadcast hour, and maybe another round of applause. And let's
Thank you.
and maybe one last question from Ken Stein here, and then we'll proceed across to the Veterans Building.
Again, a great example of how Vollmer would develop somebody else's idea. He didn't come up with modus operandi, but he saw that it could be very useful in policing, so he developed it and expanded it and created his own MO system that ended up being used, and it was published in a journal article about 1916, and again, it was commonly used and spread from there. So he advanced it, is what he did. He advanced a lot of things. Developing things out of whole cloth, he usually did not do. And again, his greatest strength was getting other people and encouraging them to go on and invent and do great things. You're welcome.
Okay, so we are concluded, and no, we're not. I'm sorry. And our new president has a final remark.
Well, thank you for electing me, and I'm looking forward to a pretty exciting year, culminating in our 40th anniversary celebration of the founding of the Berkeley Historical Society. I know you're all sitting on those hard seats and would like to get on over to see the exhibit, so I'll just say, please feel free to speak to me about your dreams about the future of Berkeley Historical Society. Thanks.
And we have there are copies of the book that are for sale outside here, but we'll also have them for sale over at the History Center. And if you haven't been there before, the best way is to just walk up the street to the intersection, cross on the far side of the street, and go up to the middle of the block.